Good evening, everyone. My name is Usha Venkatesh. I'm the Interim Dean for English Language for Academic Purposes, Linguistics, and Communication Studies. And I am thrilled to welcome you this evening to the Frank Islam Athenaeum Symposia series event. This is our final event for this semester, and I'm really happy to have you all be here. This distinguished speaker series, which has been made possible through a generous gift from philanthropist and civic leader, Mr. Frank Islam, offers presentations on timely, stimulating topics delivered by today's leading experts in international affairs, social sciences, the humanities, arts, politics, and economics. This semester, our lineup explores the theme of culture, diffusion, and power. Each speaker will discuss elements of cross-cultural and temporal experiences, the intermingling of ideas, and the consequences, both good and bad, of doing so. You can find more information about this series by grabbing one of the bookmarks out front, by visiting our website, and by joining our mailing list. We also have evaluation surveys that were handed out to you as you came in, if you came in from upstairs. And we encourage you to fill them out and drop them off on the way out. They help us plan future events for the series. Before we begin, there are a few practical notes to share. If you're a student who may need a certificate of attendance for being here today, they will be available at the exit after the talk. For faculty and staff who may be attending and wish to get multicultural diversity credit, if you haven't done so already, you may also sign up at the entrance table after the talk. We do ask you to silence your cell phones and turn off all screens to avoid distractions to others. Also, there will be an opportunity for question and answers following the presentation. There are 2 microphones on the aisles. At the designated time, we request that you make your way to one of those and ask your questions from there. Please plan your questions accordingly. I would also like to add that we do have a surprise for those of you who are in attendance today, but you will have to remain in your seats until the end of the question and answer session in order to find out. And after the talk, we invite you to participate to continue the conversation in the upstairs lobby with some light refreshments. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Jennifer Hadel, Professor of Political Science here on the Germantown campus, to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. Last year, I started placing a time date stamp on some of the handouts for my American government courses. Events had started to move so fast that if I prepared the handout Monday morning at 9 a.m., it would often be outdated later that same day. In class, we'd be talking about potential changes in the president's cabinet, and a student would jump in with breaking news of a resignation thanks to a cell phone notification. In the middle of a 50-minute class, the content we were covering could go from being a discussion of potentials to a discussion of an historical moment in a second. This provides some unexpected moments and the occasional extra credit question in political science classes. But what does the speed of news, the norm shifting in the political system, and that general sense that the time is out of joint do to us as citizens and denizens living in the United States? How do we adapt and thrive as a democracy? Fortunately, we have Dr. Lauren C. Bell here to help us think through these questions. Dr. Lauren C. Bell is currently Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor of Political Science at Randolph-Macon College in Virginia. Dr. Bell holds a BA from the College of Worcester and an MA and PhD from the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center at the University of Oklahoma. She has served as a fellow on the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary and as a U.S. Supreme Court fellow at the U.S. Sentencing Commission. Dr. Bell has written several books, including Filibustering in the U.S. Senate and Warring Factions, Interest Groups, Money, and the New Politics of Senate Confirmation. She has co-authored Slingshot, The Defeat of Eric Cantor, and Perspectives on Political Communication. In addition, she has published in a number of scholarly journals, including Journal of Politics, Political Research Quarterly, and the Journal of Legislative Studies. Her work has also informed the public dialogue in media like Newsweek, Roll Call, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and the Washington Post. Please help me welcome Dr. Lauren C. Bell.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that really warm introduction. I feel I've been oversold a bit, but thank you very much. Let's set this down. So my family lived in Rockville, just down the road, for about 10 years when I was in college and graduate school. And one of my oldest friends, Ben Nicholson, who is chair of the Mathematics and Statistics Department on the Rockville campus, is in the audience. So Montgomery College is a familiar place for me, and it's truly an honor to be here this evening. When I was asked to talk to all of you as part of the Athenaeum Symposium, I struggled a bit with what to talk about. As University of Denver political scientist Seth Maskett has written, "What's it like to be a political scientist now? Imagine being an astronomer at a time when all the stars just fall out of the sky and bounce on the ground, and everyone's all, so what happens next?" Well, I think Seth overstates things a bit. He's not entirely wrong about the self-consciousness that many of us feel these days as we try to make sense of what's happening politically in our country. And indeed, I do feel quite self-conscious as I stand up here tonight. I suspect some of you came tonight thinking that I'll be able to make sense of what's happening. And unfortunately, I can't promise that. I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. But what I hope to do in the next 40 minutes or so is to offer some thoughts about where we are and where we might go from here. As a spoiler, let me say that in politics, like sports, or for those in my friend Ben's department, like in statistics, there's almost always a regression to the mean. What I mean by that is that as time goes on, extreme events tend to be followed by much less extreme events, such that things even out over time. So in that sense, my title tonight, Not Just Politics as Usual, is a bit misleading. In fact, as I'll share, I believe that our current political conditions aren't all that different from some other eras in American politics. And so while many of us are at a loss to figure out exactly how we got where we are right now, I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future. My remarks proceed as follows. I will first offer some perspectives on politics today, and then I'll move to put what is happening today into some historical context. That context includes, as we'll see, longstanding problems in American democracy with fake news, and a longstanding trend toward partisan polarization. Finally, I'll talk about how we can overcome the anxiety and paralysis many of us are feeling in order to make sure that the democratic principles we share are better protected. The short version on that is that it's essential that we remain engaged and positive, even when it feels like there's not much point. What I hope will become apparent is that while the magnitude of the challenges that we're confronting these days might be greater than in previous eras, the challenges themselves are not new, and our system has actually proven to be quite resilient to them. So let's start with an overview of where we are right now. Okay, so there's definitely a lot happening on this slide, and I don't expect you to be able to read it or see it. But let me decode it a little bit for you. On the left-hand side, what you see is a list of conditions that experts believe are essential to a democratic society. These are things like the geographic boundaries of electoral districts do not systematically advantage any political party, elected officials seek compromise with political opponents, citizens have access to information about candidates that is relevant to how they would govern, elections are free from foreign influence, the judiciary is able to effectively limit executive power, and elections are conducted, ballots counted, and winners determined without pervasive fraud or manipulation. These data come, I can't reach it with my pointer, but they come from the Bright Line Watch. It's a group of political scientists who have been conducting surveys in a series of waves. About every 6 months, they reach out to a group of political scientists to ask them to rank all of these important political precursors for democracy. They also have been doing a public survey as well. The orange bars, over there somewhere, there we go. The orange bars represent the percentage of political scientists at US colleges and universities who said that the US fully or mostly meets the standards that they consider essential for democracy. I should mention, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm one of the 747 political scientists that they surveyed. So somewhere in there are my answers as well. And the blue bars represent the percentage of the 2,000 public respondents who said that the US fully or mostly meets this standard. And so even without being able to necessarily read everything on the screen, what you see is that there are clearly very significant differences between public perceptions of how our democracy is working and how expert political scientists see the political world. When compared with the members of the public who were surveyed, the political scientists were more concerned with low voter turnout, gerrymandering, access to the vote, and the role of money in politics, while being far less worried about the institutions of government, judicial independence, or the ability for people to speak freely. And so the good news is that these survey results demonstrate that those of us who've spent a long time studying government and politics are mostly concerned about problems with American democracy that are actually solvable with enough time and enough action. While members of the public, which of course we don't expect to have the same level of political knowledge, appear to be more deeply suspicious of government itself. This, of course, is not surprising. For nearly 40 years, we can go back at least to 1981 with President Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address, in which he stated, quote, "Government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem," end quote. Americans have been told by politicians of both parties that their government does not care about them. And as a result, they have tended to tune out, which, as I'll get to in a few minutes, is precisely the wrong reaction. Returning to the experts' opinions, on this slide is the experts' rating of US democratic performance today as compared with ratings of democratic performance at important historical moments in time. So what you see if you look at this slide is that the experts rate US democratic performance today at approximately the same level as our country's level of democratization in the 1970s, and only slightly lower than in the early 2000s. These data, by the way, are taken from the same survey as the data on the previous slide. The black line on this slide represents those data, and the gray bars are presented by these researchers to show how closely their analysis mirrors the analysis of another independent group, the Varieties of Democracy Project. That's another scholarly consortium that looks at levels of democratic performance across the world. Now, this might not be ideal to see the backsliding, that's the VDEM's term, the backsliding that has occurred in levels of democratic performance. But if we think back to what was happening during the 1970s, that was a period during which there were a number of difficult issues confronting our government and dividing the public. Things like whether children could or should be bused from school district to promote racial balance, and the ultimately unsuccessful efforts to ratify the amendment to the Constitution to provide equal rights to women. And of course, if we think back to the early 2000s, the public was reeling from a presidential election that it essentially perceived as being decided by the US Supreme Court, followed less than a year later by the deadliest terror attack on US soil and the beginning of the endless war on terror. And so we might not be excited to see these democratic performance lines in decline, but where we are today isn't that much different in the estimates of these experts from where we've been in the not so distant past. And we should take at least some comfort in the Varieties of Democracy's project's conclusion to their 2018 report that, quote, democracy is still in good standing across the world, end quote, and that global levels of democracy remain close to their all-time high. So why do we feel so bad? Well, for one thing, the Obama years saw extraordinarily high levels of democratic performance, according to the experts. You can see there, those are the Obama years. So part of what we're feeling now is likely a reaction to the difference between what we experienced only a few years ago and what we're feeling today. Traditional college-age students, who some of you are in the room today, don't have any memory of how things felt in the early 2000s. But for some of us, how we felt then feels similar to how we feel now, even if the specifics are quite different. But that brings me to the next section of my talk tonight, which is about putting our current politics into historical context. And so as I turn to that section, I want to sort of explain two basic premises that are informing my thinking here. And the first, this won't be so comforting, is that no matter how bad things seem now, they could always be, and in fact have often been, a heck of a lot worse. Now, again, that may not be much comfort, but I do think we get so caught up in the news of the day, or sometimes the news of the hour, that we fail to locate events in their proper historical context. And that, in turn, prevents us from being able to take a step back and analyze what's happening in a dispassionate way. The second premise that I'm operating from is that many contemporary events are just a modern rehashing of conflicts that have existed from the beginning of our republic. It's thus our collective failure to resolve these conflicts that leads history to repeat itself. Literary performer and educator Reggie Gibson has said that, quote, our problem as Americans is that we hate history. What we love is nostalgia. He goes on to say, we love to remember things exactly the way they didn't happen. Or, as a more recent book by Rosling, and Ronlin write, it's called Factfulness, objects in your memories are worse than they appear. What both of these quotes point to, of course, is the fact that particularly in today's 24/7 social media saturated news cycles, we rarely take the time to reflect deeply on how things used to be. Instead, we live in the moment, often concluding that the bad things happening today are really worse than anything that's ever happened before. So, in political terms, for those inclined to see President Trump as the worst president in history, they may not be remembering that just over a decade ago, many Americans were anointing George W. Bush as the worst president in history. And 20 years earlier, those old enough to remember know that Jimmy Carter was wearing that crown. Now, in fairness, our current president does not fare well in rankings of US presidents. In a ranking released in February, Siena University reported that of 157 scholars surveyed, they ranked Trump the third worst president in history, behind Andrew Johnson and James Buchanan. Johnson, of course, was impeached and nearly removed from office by a Congress that was upset with his interference in Reconstruction after the Civil War. And for his part, as James Buchanan's biographer Gene Baker has said, quote, he came closer to committing treason than any other president in American history, end quote. So I mean, while according to the experts, President Trump isn't the worst president we've ever had, that probably isn't saying a whole lot. But the more serious point here, of course, is that most of us aren't well enough versed in presidential history to really be able to compare how well our current president stacks up to past presidents, particularly in terms of policy proposals. Our evaluations are based on our perceptions of his behavior, filtered through our own perception of whether it's appropriate or not. We're limited in our assessments because we simply don't have enough knowledge about what's happened before. So take, by way of example, the treatment of racial minorities in the United States. Many people are quite rightly concerned that Donald Trump has equivocated on whether or not white supremacists are bad people. Indeed, 60% of respondents to a Pew Research survey conducted at the end of December 2017 said that Donald Trump has made race relations in the US worse. But the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map tracker shows that while the number of hate groups the organization was tracking last year, 1,018, is high, that number is actually virtually identical to the number of groups the organization was tracking in 2011, when it was tracking 1,020 groups. I didn't know that. My assumption, as I looked at the hate map, by the way, this changed how this talk proceeded, was that the numbers from today would be substantially higher than the numbers from a decade ago, and I was wrong. The point is, the passage of time has led us to forget just how bad things were before. Now, I'm certainly not intending to downplay or diminish the problems of hate speech and hate crimes. I fully acknowledge that race relations have declined in the US in the last few years and that there are real and important differences in how individuals of different races, genders, gender identities, national origins, and religious beliefs have been treated by our current administration. We're right to be concerned. But we also need to remember that things are better now in so many respects than they used to be. So let me illustrate this point in a slightly different way. Consider this from 1942. Yes, this is a terribly racist cartoon drawn by none other than Dr. Seuss. It was published in the liberal-leaning New York newspaper PM. And this is not the only cartoon of its type drawn by Dr. Seuss and published by PM. In fact, just 6 days following the publication of this cartoon, then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which allowed the Secretary of War to designate certain areas on the west coast of the United States as military exclusion areas, and which authorized the use of federal troops to forcibly remove any or all people residing in those areas in the interest of national security. Now, of course, we know it wasn't all people who were removed. Almost everyone removed from those areas was an American citizen of Japanese descent. As Richard Manier, author of Dr. Seuss Goes to War, explains, quote, "We see here a blind spot of the wartime New York left. A few people spoke out against America's concentration camps, but only a few. More failed to see a civil rights issue of monumental consequence. No reader of PM wrote in to protest this cartoon. At least no such letter appeared among the letters to the editor. As we shall see, there were letters against his attack on the pacifist preacher John Haynes Holmes and against his slander of dachshunds. But there was no letter against this stark example of mainstream American racism against Asians in America," end quote. Consider by comparison the significant public outcry over the current administration's travel ban and family separation policies. And consider also the partisan political consequences suffered by Republicans in Congress, who in 2018 lost an excessively gerrymandered House of Representatives by double digits in what should have been an incredibly uphill battle for Democrats to retake the House. Unlike in 1942, there have been consequences of the naked racism exhibited and institutionalized by the current administration. And so while things are far, far, far from perfect, they are in many respects better now than they have been before. The second point I wanted to make as we think about historical context is that there is little that happens in politics that hasn't happened before. Indeed, consider the second wartime cartoon from Dr. Seuss. This cartoon could have been published this week. It could just as easily illustrate the current administration's rhetoric and its relationship with nationalist and communist governments throughout the world. I share this image because it illustrates another important point. Even geopolitics can repeat themselves. And of course, there may be another reason for at least some optimism. While our human rights record during World War II was, by all measures, pretty terrible, in the end, the United States came to its senses and took a leadership role in defeating the Axis powers. Now, we can identify this sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same condition in any number of aspects of our politics. So, looking at something a little less weighty than these Dr. Seuss cartoons, for years I've collected campaign buttons. So here's a picture of some of my favorites from my collection. By the way, in Maryland, you have wonderful antique shops where you can find lots of campaign buttons. And they're useful artifacts because they tell powerful stories in really tiny packages. So they often include portraits of the candidates. Historically, they would have been drawings, later photographs. Or sometimes they include the campaign slogan or a reference point to a historical event. You can even tell which buttons were officially produced by the campaign and which ones weren't. For example, in this image, with the Dewey for President button, you can actually see a small, what they call union bug on the bottom of the, bottom edge of the button. And this tells you that a union printer was hired to print the button, which also tells you that this was most likely an official campaign object. Those buttons that aren't produced by the campaign typically don't include that union bug, and they're often edgier and more negative because they're produced by supporters or groups of supporters who may feel little need to conform their messaging. So here's an example of an anti-Hillary Clinton campaign button from 2016. These were spotted at the souvenir stands outside the Republican National Convention in Cleveland that year. But consider this from my own collection. This anti-Eleanor Roosevelt button was sold during the 1940 presidential campaign between FDR and Wendell Willkie. Like the anti-Clinton button, it wasn't an official button propagated by the campaign, but it was a popular button used to capture the sentiment of the times. Willkie supporters produced multiple buttons attacking the First Lady, which had never been done before and was quite shocking during the time. As I said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that brings me to two of the issues that I highlighted in the title of my presentation, the issues of fake news and hyperpartisanship. It might also surprise you to know that neither of these phenomena are especially new either. So this is the audience participation portion of tonight's presentation. Consider this quote. There has been more new error propagated by the press in the last 10 years than in 100 years. Does anyone have any guesses as to who said this or when? Who? Trump? Nope. Anyone else? Bernie Sanders? Nope. Nope. You guys, these are great guesses, right? You would expect, this is why I wanted to get audience participation going on, right? Great guesses. There's the rest of the quote. Right. Adams was reacting to the French philosopher Nicolas de Condorcet's assertion that a free press was the best safeguard against the spread of erroneous information. Adams was not the only one of the founding fathers to be vexed by what he felt were malicious falsehoods being spread about him. No less than George Washington himself was forced to combat lies about his loyalty to the newly free United States of America. So this is a copy of a letter that it was on the last day of his presidency, President Washington writes to Secretary of State Timothy Pickering in 1797. It's a little hard to see. Also, it's a little hard to read even if you can see it. So fortunately, the Library of Congress has made a translation available. And I'll just share this relevant passage. Quote, "At the conclusion of my public employments, I have thought it expedient to notice the publication of certain forged letters which first appeared in the year 1777 and were obtruded upon the public as mine. They are said by the editor to have been found in a small portmanteau that I had left in the care of my mulatto servant named Billy, who, it is pretended, was taken prisoner at Fort Lee in 1776. The period when these letters were first printed will be recollected, and what were the impressions they were intended to produce on the public mind. It was then supposed to be of some consequence to strike at the integrity of the motives of the American commander-in-chief and to paint his inclinations at variance with his professions and his duty. Another crisis in the affairs of America having occurred, the same weapon has been resorted to wound my character and deceive the people." End quote. Washington submitted this letter to Pickering on his last day in office with a request to Pickering to preserve it so that the truth would be known, quote, "to the present generation and to posterity." His letter explains that the letters about him could only possibly be forged, since his manservant Billy had never actually been captured during the Revolutionary War, and that everybody in his command would be willing to attest to that fact. And so the fact is, in the 18th and much of the 19th centuries, there was no such thing as an unbiased news source. And much of the time, the writers and publishers of leaflets, broadsides, and newspapers simply made things up. So when the president accuses the media of spreading fake news, that's not a new concern for our politicians. But for those of us who are forced to consume the news, how are we to know what's real and what isn't? So I'll come back to that in my conclusion in just a few minutes, but the short answer is that we need to educate ourselves both about politics and about what media sources are credible, so we are better able to discern what is real. Like fake news, hyper-partisanship has a long history. This is an artist's rendering of the fight that broke out on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1798 between Connecticut Representative Roger Griswold, who is depicted with the cane, and Vermont's Matthew Lyon, who is depicted with a pair of fireplace tongs. The two men argued over whether or not the U.S. should prepare for a possible war with France. Griswold was a Federalist who supported a hardline stance, while Lyon was a Republican who preferred that the U.S. not make war preparations, lest we actually be inclined to go to war. During a debate between the two of them, Lyon spit tobacco juice at Griswold. Griswold then called for Lyon's expulsion from the House, and when the House declined to expel him, Griswold took matters into his own hands. According to the House of Representatives Historical Office, this episode illustrated significant factionalism even prior to the formation of formal political parties in this country. We can get some sense of partisan dynamics in the modern era by considering responses to the question about party ID on the American National Election Studies Quadrennial Survey. Here, I've run the numbers from the National Election Studies data set, and I've calculated the proportion of Democrats. And by Democrats here, I mean those who say they are Democrats or who say they are independent but lean Democrat. Because despite what you hear, the number of independents in this country really is not increasing dramatically, because most independents, when you ask them a follow-up question, will confess that they actually align themselves with one party or the other. So the Democratic number includes those who say they are Democrats or who say they lean Democratic as independents, and the Republican line includes those who say they are Republican or that they lean Republican even as independents. And when we look at these plots, what struck me is that party identification has been remarkably stable over the last, or more stable over the last 65 years than we might expect given current events. On average, about 50% of the population identifies as a Democrat, about 40% identifies as a Republican, about 10% identifies as truly independent. But there are, as you can see, some rather large deviations from the average. If we look at party ID during the 2016 presidential election, what we see is just like in 2000, respondents expressed almost the same degree of support for each of the two major parties. And so it's not surprising that there's currently a greater degree of partisan conflict because the electorate is much more evenly divided between the two major parties than they have been in the past. Add to that the gridlock that can come from divided government, when one party controls the White House but the other controls one or both houses of Congress, and it's no surprise that partisans from both parties dig in and refuse to compromise. And interestingly, however, where partisanship in the electorate has been roughly stable, within the Congress itself, there are now almost no moderates in either chamber. Gerrymandering, competitive primary elections, and the so-called big sort, the movement of people into neighborhoods where people look and think like them, all contributes to the polarization we see reflected within our governmental institutions. So while on average, the two parties today command roughly the same levels of support that they always did, this support is less diffuse and more concentrated into particular geographic areas. Now, if that alone weren't problematic enough, the problem is exacerbated by the lack of a single, consistent source of high-quality, unbiased political information, which makes it difficult for people with different political viewpoints to agree even on the basic facts of a situation, let alone on how to reach a consensus to address it. Here's the Pew Research Center's study of where Americans get political information, broken out by age. As you can see, younger people are far more likely to get their news from social media or a news website than they are from newspapers or even television, whereas the overwhelming majority of Americans over the age of 50 are getting their political news from TV. And as we know, often that means from a cable network with a particular partisan skew. And age is a factor in understanding partisanship as well. Older voters tend to support the Republican Party more often, while younger voters tend to support Democrats more frequently. In fact, we see real differences in party identification on the basis not only of age, but also on the basis of gender, race, and ethnicity. And these differences in group-wise support for the parties also lead the parties to focus their attention on different issues. As we see, Republicans and Democrats have significantly different priorities when it comes to what they think our government ought to be working on. There's some agreement. Transportation, jobs, Social Security fit in the middle. But if you look at some of the most important issues confronting us, things like climate change or terrorism, Republicans and Democrats prioritize those things very differently. So, yes, our politics today are polarized, but that polarization comes not only from partisan conflict, but also as a result of real differences in demography, policy preferences, and information resources. Partisanship alone can't completely explain our current politics. Indeed, consider this. Even if we were to eliminate political parties, gridlock wouldn't go away. The design of our political institutions entrenches conflict between Congress and the White House. There are important differences constitutionally in electorates. Presidents have a national constituency. Members of the House have one small geographic constituency. Senators have full states. There are also differences in term lengths and term limits. Presidents have them, members of Congress do not. And these are constitutionally imposed constraints on the ability of the political branches to work together that would exist even if we could eliminate political parties. So where does all of this leave us? So I've demonstrated that expert assessments of our current political climate are somewhat better than the public's assessments, that when considered in the fullness of historical time, our current politics are not nearly as bad as they have been in the past, that many of the conditions that plague our current politics, including fake news and hyper-partisanship, have characterized politics in America since the founding era. And finally, that polarization is the result of ideological sorting and not just increased partisanship. And so all of that is to say that while it can be tempting to simply throw up our hands, the reality is that we have the politics and government we have today in no small part because of our own patterns of movement and our insistence on ideological purity in our leaders. But it's also to say that we've met and overcome far greater challenges throughout our history. How have we done so? Or, probably more importantly for all of us, how can we do so now? I firmly believe that the most important thing we can do is to remain or to become engaged and active citizens. But I want to explain what I mean by that. Being an active and engaged citizen doesn't mean you have to engage on everything. I have a good friend who, after the 2016 election, threw herself headlong into the #resistance movement. She devoted her time and energy to writing postcards, calling congressional offices, marching in Washington and Richmond, and trying to monitor quite literally every decision the president and Congress made. And predictably, she burned out. Donald Trump was still inaugurated. The travel ban took effect. Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh were added to the Supreme Court. And my friend actually got very depressed, as in clinically, medically depressed. In no small part because she felt as though all of her efforts had amounted to nothing. But her efforts, and those of many people like her, did matter. The 2018 congressional midterm elections, if nothing else, were proof of that. And so it's important to remain committed to engaged citizenship. It works, even though the payoff may not be immediate. Indeed, as Rosling, and Ronlin point out in Factfulness, quote, when people wrongly believe that nothing is improving, they may conclude that nothing we have tried is working and lose confidence in measures that actually work. Or they may become radicals, supporting drastic measures that are counterproductive, when in fact the methods we are using to improve our world are working just fine. I think we all probably know people who fit into both of those categories. Still, as we engage as citizens, it's important to first take a deep breath before we commit to any action. It gets really easy to get sucked into the latest drama from a presidential tweet or an allegation of scandal. And it can be really hard to resist the temptation to engage in political debates on social media. By the way, I'm pretty confident that no one has actually won any of those political debates on social media. If we try to fight every battle, we'll burn out. So being strategic in your engagement is essential. Second, engaged citizenship means being informed. I'm sure that all of you, like me, know lots of people who have very strong opinions on things they know nothing about. Don't be one of them. Do your research. Make sure you know your history and stick to the facts as you work to persuade colleagues or even elected leaders of your views. Make sure that as you cast your vote, you are doing so based on the best information possible and not simply on the basis of partisan cues or what your friends and family have told you to do. Put your phone down. Nothing will make you feel worse about your life or about our civic life collectively than endlessly scrolling through political Twitter. Check the news once per day on a reputable news site, and don't subscribe to every possible news alert that could be pushed to your phone. On this point, I'm often asked what news sources I trust, and honestly, I'm pretty boring. If you want to get a pretty straightforward recounting of the day's news, tune into one of the big three legacy networks, ABC, CBS, or NBC. These networks have to appeal to a broad audience, and their newscasts typically reflect a much less ideological approach than cable or internet sources. They also have to make judgments about what is important to fit into 30-minute time blocks. Compare that with the 24/7 news cycle, and that'll give you some sense of why I think the legacy networks offer the best source of news. Fourth, when you're confronted with a policy choice or a political claim, ask yourself who wins and who loses under the scenario described. Across-the-board tax cuts sounded like a really great idea back in 2017, but how many of you felt good as you paid your taxes last week? In fact, by 2027, PolitiFact estimates that every income level below $75,000 a year will pay more in taxes than they did before the tax cut was enacted. Politics is often a zero-sum game. For every benefit that someone is receiving, someone else might be losing out. So think about these dynamics and figure out who wins and who loses as you think about who or what you want to support. Finally, and most importantly, resist the urge to just tune it all out. Seriously, thinking about who wins and loses, think about who wins when you completely tune out. Political scientists agree that our country's founders agree with our country's founders that an engaged and informed citizenry is essential to democracy. As Michael Deli Carpini and Scott Keeter have written, quote, factual knowledge about politics is a critical component of citizenship, one that is essential if citizens are to discern their real interests and take effective advantage of the civic opportunities afforded them. Knowledge is the keystone to other civic requisites. In the absence of adequate information, neither passion nor reason is likely to lead to decisions that reflect the real interests of the public, end quote. And so in closing, let me return to where I started and say that I'm generally optimistic that our extraordinary politics of today, as truly extraordinary as they are, will at some point regress to the mean. But we each have a role to play in making sure that that happens. Staying engaged, choosing our battles, and resisting the urge to follow the social media rabbit hole into the abyss are good places to start. With that, I'll end, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bell, for your insights and putting things in better perspective. However, I have one issue.
Sure.
When in previous periods of time has there been as much incivility as there is today, where people in positions of authority and so forth have just demeaned and just stated things in such a way that it's hard to trust them, it's hard to follow them because that gets in the way. So is there an era that maybe I'm missing? I was a political science major myself.
Sure.
So I kind of follow these kinds of things from that perspective. But I'm just not able to look back and say there just was, there was an era before it was just as uncivil as today. Thank you.
Sure. Excellent question, and I'm not sure I have a wholly satisfactory answer to that, but I have two thoughts. First, I think both the founding era and the Civil War era were equally as incivil, but I think but I suspect there are other eras that were, that if we knew more about them, would be equally as bad. There has never been an era where so much information is available in real time, day in and day out. And so plenty of presidents have made incivil remarks before. We know this from memoirs, we know this from papers, we know this from biographies, but those were simply not covered by the media. They were chalked up to the pressures of the position, for example. And so, it's funny because I'm a big proponent of as much free speech as possible, but I do think we have so much free speech. We have so many outlets where people can learn about what was said, or where something that was said leaves a small circle of people and is amplified across the country or even across the globe, and that has contributed to the incivility. So I think we do have at least some historical eras where we know there was public incivility at similar levels. Again, the founding era, the Civil War era come to my mind. But I think the incivility is amplified right now in ways that technology simply had not made possible before.
It's a hike up here to ask a question. Thank you. This is terrific, and I share many of these views that our history is so complex and has so many dimensions to it that we ought not lose sight of those parallels. There is one theme, as you know, in political science and in other perspectives that suggests there is a difference today from the past. David Brooks has a new book out in which he argues our issues are not hyper-partisanship, they are hyper-individualism. And this, of course, comes out of political science research that we've lost the connectivity. And I noticed you didn't have in your list of 5 there, engage with others. So I want to pitch that question to you in the broader sense, but also make it a very particular one. If there is a way in which we should try to be rebuilding the connections we have among each other than just those connections with people that we're sharing everything with, what is the role that the colleges of the country can play? What can universities and colleges and community colleges do to contribute to rebuilding this connectivity with others?
Yeah, so those are really great questions. And so the rest of you know, Michael Brintenall was like kind of my boss in a way when you were executive director of the American Political Science Association. I was, well, okay. we can quibble over that, but we'll be civil about it. I think you're absolutely right. As you were talking about the hyper-individualism, I'm thinking of, two of my mentors who wrote the book, The Atomistic Congress, who commented, and this is again back in the mid-90s, that members of Congress were not engaging with each other. In fact, they were operating as individuals, and that was affecting the quality of public policy making. I think hyper-individualism is a huge problem. In fact, as I reflected after the 2016 election about what I felt was most important, it seemed to me, or what action I wanted to take, I decided that I was going to be nice and friendly to everyone. And this might sound silly. It might sound like, well, that doesn't do anything. It's not like my friend who literally spent hour upon hour upon hour of writing postcards. But that sense of wondering if the person, walking down the street ahead of you is a friend or an enemy. Do they think like me? Will I like them? Are they part of the people responsible for this problem that we have now? To me, that was not the approach I wanted to take, even as I knew many people who got very bitter. And so I think it's absolutely essential to engage. And I think the colleges and universities are remarkable places where that can happen in ways that it can't kind of in society more generally. If you walk across a college campus, you will often see people talking to each other. Just whether it's at a coffee shop, in the library, on a bench, college campuses are places where conversations can happen. And for many students, it's the first time that they're exposed to people who look different from them, who come from a different environment than they came from, or who have totally different viewpoints on a range of issues. And because of the unique places that university settings are, where you get to express yourself and spread your wings and try new things and meet new people, but in a really safe and controlled way, it's the perfect opportunity to reach out, to make friends with people who are different from you. And so I thank you for that question, Michael. I think the individualism today is really problematic. Again, put your phone down, right? How many times have you gone to a restaurant and watched as two people sit across the table from each other and just each of them is on their phone and not engaging in conversation? And obviously, there are times that something is happening, you need to check your phone. But engaging with other people, particularly with people you've never met before who might be different from you, is really important. So I agree. I think the individualism is certainly wrapped up in this. It's a consequence of this. And I think, besides just helping kind of politics generally by engaging with others, you also get to meet interesting people by talking to other people, or learn something about a friend that maybe you didn't know before.
Hi, I want to ask a question about bipartisanship.
Sure.
So it seems that nothing ever gets accomplished nowadays, and I recall a time when when Congress was debating the Affordable Care Act, and Democrats reached out and included many, many amendments from Republicans, and then Mitch McConnell just decided to block it, and now he has just blocked everything, and I'm certainly a biased individual against him,
Sure.
but will there ever be a time when they can work together, or are we just not ever going to get anything done unless we, either Republicans or Democrats,
Sure.
are in control?
Yeah, so I think two things. One is, even today, there is still more bipartisan working together that occurs on Capitol Hill than any of us are aware of. If you talk to people, if you talk to members, if you talk to staff members, they will talk about the fact that so much of what goes on behind the scenes, what we see reported, is actually done in engagement with offices from across the aisle. Certainly, and now it's been 20 years, that was my experience when I worked on the Hill, well, and even 10 years ago or 12 years ago when I was working in legislative affairs for the Sentencing Commission. There's a fair amount of bipartisan working together that we just don't hear about because it's not interesting, right? If you're trying to whip up your base or you're trying to win an election, talking about how you like to cooperate with folks across the aisle is not generally perceived as a smart move. That's problematic. That's a piece of what you described. But so that's the caveat. There is still bipartisanship that we see taking place. You mentioned Mitch McConnell. He's a particular breed of partisan. My take on McConnell is that he has a vision for how he thinks the Senate should operate. He is willing to kind of blow up the norms of the chamber if it will result in partisan gain. I'm not convinced that he represents most members of the U.S. Senate, but he's in a position of leadership. So will we ever see a return to something different? Well, the funny thing is, and this is what I mean about our insistence on ideological purity, Democrats actually do, if you look historically, tend to reach across the aisle. But they have lately been vilified internally by fellow partisans who have said, great, let's elect the Democrats back into office so the Republicans can get some things done, right? The sense is that Democrats should now do exactly the same thing that Republicans have done and shut out the other party. And maybe if you have unified government, you might be able to accomplish something that way. But at some level, I think we would expect to see more bipartisanship, more overt bipartisanship with Democrats in control, much to the chagrin of some ideological purists in the Democratic Party. And so the Democrats themselves are wrestling with whether or not they want to be bipartisan, because certainly it has become clear that the Republican Party is not interested in bipartisanship.
So I have more of an observation than a question, and I want to use your own data sets. For the VDEM graph you had at the beginning was very interesting because it shows, I'd love you to bring it up.
Yeah, I can go back. It'll just take me a second. Sorry. Fortunately, there are not that many slides.
Nope, you passed it. That was it.
There we go.
Because it shows a fairly steady increase over time, all the way back from early 1800s. The fact of the matter is you keep saying it's equivalent now to the 1970s, but if you look at it, we went from a high level and in 2 years lost 40 years worth of progress on the chart. And another example is you mentioned the number of hate groups, for instance, and the hate groups have stayed the same, but they've become emboldened. There's a change in the way that they can operate within our society. So these are all things that I look at that show, if that trend continues as a mathematician, that's not a good trend right there. You don't want it to keep going down. Is it going to stop going down? Is it going to eventually elevate and come back up? That's an open question in my mind.
But this was a fairly rapid rise, and this is what some of the reaction is, which is that assessments during the Obama era, and these are again sort of expert assessments, right? So assessments during the Obama era were pretty rosy, and there's again the other thing to know about this, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I think there are certainly degrees of all of this, right? And so the first question was about how incivility has increased. There are certainly degrees of this. I absolutely agree with that. But the other thing to remember is that these particular data are experts from 6 months ago evaluating, well, how was it back in 1900, right? So again, there's some question as to how valid are these observations. But I take your point, and I think it's an important one. The degree to which many of these things are happening now is certainly different from the past. I guess I would just respond by saying that's all the more reason that we have to become much more active and engaged. When I talk to my students, they say, yeah, this is interesting, but then you ask them on election day, so did you vote today? No. Well, okay, I need to vote at home, and home's 3 hours, and I'm not going to drive home. Well, you didn't, no absentee ballot. There's just not a level of engagement yet. And when people get active and engaged, these things start to move. But the experts, again, if I go back one more, and again, I apologize because it's hard to see, they're more concerned with things like low voter turnout or with the challenges to voting rights in states like North Carolina and other places that have, I mean, a good example right now is what's happening up in Maine with the idea that college students have to register their vehicles in order to be able to vote during elections. So they're much more concerned about those kinds of sort of legal impediments to participation. And those are things that with enough momentum could be changed. Right? So, but I think you're absolutely right. I think it is a matter of degree. But if we throw up our hands, it won't get better.
In order to choose a president in democracy, why they have to look for a humanitarian president, I think, and they have to look for the quality and the humanity size, and they have to look for the good America to become good in America. Not because Trump is not a good president at all. I think he's not humanitarian. He has only power and business. I don't know why America chooses Trump. I need a humanitarian president. He has to be equality and the human being. Thank you.
Sure. So if I understood, what you're saying is basically, so how did we end up with Trump? Because he's not, in your estimation, a good person.
Yes.
Right.
I think humanitarian president would be better for America, because humanitarian president will help the equality of this America will be great again. Thank you.
Sure. So I can't disagree with you. I agree. I think having a humanitarian president would be ideal. I'm not sure who I would say of our past presidents would fit that description. For a lot of people, I think they would say, well, President Obama comes closest, but then, of course, I think about the fact that this was the same president who started some of the the border policies that are not so fantastic. He also authorized drone strikes, unmanned drone strikes. And so how would we assess whether someone was humanitarian, I think is often one of the considerations. I think a couple of things. One, I think nobody 6 months prior to the election really expected that Trump would win. So I think for many people it was sort of like, oh, well, haha, this is funny. I'm upset with our current political system. That'll show them. I'll cast a protest vote. Word on the street is Trump didn't think he was going to win and was surprised on election night. But choosing a president for people often comes down to things like, are they going to enact my preferred policies? Am I going to get somebody on the Supreme Court because of who the president is that I prefer? There are many people who would say, particularly if they are pro-life, they would say, well, Trump is a humanitarian because he's put 2 justices on the court who will likely be votes against abortion rights. So people's definitions of humanitarianism are very different, and most people, as they cast their votes, are typically thinking about what is likely to improve my life the most, and not thinking, as I think you're suggesting they should, what is potentially better for all people. I don't know how we can make that a criterion much as I would like it to be.
Thank you.
Hi.
I don't know if I can't really hear. Is it okay? But a few weeks ago, I was watching a video, and this woman said that she voted for Trump as a joke. As you were saying, your friend got really heated when because she couldn't really change opinions and stuff, and she got depressed about it. But we live in a political climate right now where there's like stances on many issues are so far apart, and there's like no resolving them. And a lot of people don't have the luxury of being able to ignore certain issues. So how would you recommend getting over issues that affect people so deeply, even though it affects them so much?
So I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting people should get over any issues that affect them deeply. I, in fact, think those are exactly the right issues to focus on. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that I know a lot of people who can't differentiate the issues that really affect them from the things that have them riled up, right? So I think, you know, I know some people who, no matter what the president tweets, they flip out about it. And I don't follow the president on Twitter because I don't need that kind of like anxiety in my life, right? Because I just can't focus on that kind of, not just his comments, but then the reactions to it. That's too much negativity for me, right? And so I think, to me, I would actually encourage your friends, or you as well, to focus on those things that really do have a huge impact on you. But to do that, I think it's important to also know when you can let something go, right? When you just can say, I don't have to react to this, or I don't have to react to it now. And I think, you know, finding forums, this was, you know, the question or the comment about college and university campuses. Finding forums where you can talk to people who disagree in civilized ways, I think is really important to do. I was at a presentation in February by Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and she was asked, how are you on the bench and able to operate when you've got folks like, you know, a Justice Gorsuch or a Justice Kavanaugh, and you so fundamentally disagree with these people? How can you function in a collegial way? And her response, I thought, was really interesting. She said, you know, she views the Supreme Court as a model where you can have significant policy disagreements. You can have significant differences in how you view the world, but you still have to be able to work together. And so finding a common ground, maybe the common ground is nothing to do at all about politics. Maybe the common ground is you like the same music or you like the same restaurant, but finding that common ground so that you can come to understand each other as people gives you sometimes inroads into helping to change minds or helping somebody to see the other side of a viewpoint even when they're totally on the opposite end of the spectrum from you. So I think my advice would be to engage in those things that are deeply important to you and let the other stuff go, because that other stuff will be deeply important to some other people and they'll engage on those issues. And then to the extent that you are around people who are just polarized from you, figure out where that common ground is. Because there's no hope of changing people's minds if you just sit there and say, well, you're wrong, right? But if you can find out what makes them tick, or they can get to know you, that's going to be more powerful as far as moving people in a different way. And that gets back to this issue of not being so individualistic.
Thank you.
Hi.
I would like to know, based on your experience, do you think the press today has something to do, like John Adams says? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the press, I think we have to understand the kind of financial imperatives that operate on the media, right? So if you think about Americans and their media consumption, right, it used to be that everybody got a newspaper in the morning. Now newspaper readership has declined almost to the point of being non-existent, with the exception of some older people who still continue to get the daily newspaper. I'm generalizing, but yeah. I didn't notice anyone with white hair putting their hands up. So people have shifted in terms of their taste for what for acquiring information. Our attention spans generally have declined, right? So when you read a newspaper article, you actually can get some context and some history and some background on a situation. When you watch a broadcast that's going to maybe devote 15 seconds to something that's happening, you don't get any background or history or context. You just get a statement of something that happened, and then the media moves on to the next thing. And when you have to fill 24 hours a day of news coverage, you tend to run the same story over and over again. You have a proliferation of news shows where it's rare to find an expert on something on those news shows. Who do the journalists interview? They interview each other, right? So you get journalists talking to each other, but you don't necessarily get experts and things like that. So I do think that the way that the media operates contributes absolutely to the type of information, the degree to which we become polarized. That's why my argument is like, watch NBC, ABC, or CBS. Don't watch MSNBC. My father keeps MSNBC on all the time. It makes my stepmother crazy. But because it's just the same thing over and over and over again, and it ratchets up anxiety, and so people come to believe that anything they see is the most important thing that's happening. So I think a free press is vital, but a totally unrestrained media, particularly without people having enough understanding of how the media operates, is definitely contributing to our current circumstances.
Thank you. And my second question is this. Based on your answer, do you think President Trump gave enough work to the press, or with his tweet every single day, single hour?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I totally understood. Is giving enough work to them?
Yes, because like you say, most of the cable network, every hour, if you look, they're like, the president just tweet,
Yeah.
he just tweet. I go to work at 4 o'clock in the morning. First thing I heard the president last week before he went to bed. First thing, I think it's giving the press enough work.
So I think the press is, I think some members of the media find it easier to cover the president's tweets than to write a substantive news story about an important political event for a couple of reasons. Will anybody read the long article that they write for something like The Atlantic magazine or even, sometimes Politico or other newspapers? Well, I mean, the media also recognize that as consumers, we're not willing to devote the time and effort to learn more, to read those long articles, right? A couple of years ago, if you noticed on Facebook, a lot of the media sites would start telling you how long it would take you to read something, right? So you could decide if you wanted to click on a story. A lot of times it'll say 3-minute read, right? 7-minute read. And which of those do you think people are reading? They're reading the 3-minute read, right? I just want to get the quick snapshot so I can get on with my life. They're not reading the more extensive, longer form articles. So at some level, there's a laziness, I think, right? Trump tweets this, so the journalists cover it, and that fills some time in the news cycle. And that becomes easier than writing a long piece that provides a significant amount of context. And so we can all choose whether to get sucked into that or not. Again, there have been times that I open Twitter, look at it, close it, and I can't, right? I just can't. And the same is true for me with some news programs. I might flip on MSNBC or, sometimes Fox News or CNBC, and it's just like, okay, I can't. I just can't. Because I know there's more out there, and it's not actually productive to sit and watch what's happening. A free press is vital to American democracy, but we have so sorted our own media preferences into only watching or reading the things that reinforce our own views that I think that becomes reinforcing for those journalists and those media outlets. They only give us what we seem to want from them. I love that you all are asking questions. On my own campus, no one would be asking questions. So this is so great. Thank you.
Hi. So I'd just like to state that, I think President Trump is, the worst president in U.S. history. But I only think that way because I'm 18 years old. So like you said, I don't know what it was like in the 2000s. I don't know when Jimmy Carter wore the crown of being the worst president. So I find it interesting how you also say how in the past there have been worse moments than, President Trump. So do you think that that cycle will continue? Do you think there will be another President Trump? Do you think that with time we will forget what he did and, in the future say this person is worse?
I think that's certainly possible, right? Somebody will always be the worst president. Currently, apparently, that person is James Buchanan, if you ask the experts. But that could change, right? And again, these are expert assessments. This is not some, we don't have a mathematical scale to rate presidents. Is it possible? Sure. Do I hope that happens? No. Or am I thinking that will happen? It would be hard to say. One of the dangers with like a pendulum is that if it swings really far in one direction, it's got to swing really far in the other direction in order to correct things. But my expectation is that when Trump leaves office, whether that is in 2021 or 2025, that the pendulum will swing more back to what we tend to think of as more average president, right? But having engaged in this dialogue, there are plenty of people who think Donald Trump is a good president. And while you may not agree with that, understanding why people think that is really important because it helps us to understand why we have the political circumstances we have today. So I think recognizing that there are people who think that Donald Trump is a good president. I had an election, fortunately I didn't teach the day after Election Day in 2016. But the following day I was teaching a Congress class, so we didn't have to talk about anything relating to the election. But my students wanted to talk about it. And it was really actually it was a good moment for me because in that class, we at Randolph-Macon have a strong tradition of internships. And we have a January term, and we have a class that had just been in New Hampshire where each student was working on different presidential campaigns. That was in January, the election's in November, and I had a student in the class who worked for Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire, and I had a student in the class who worked for Donald Trump in New Hampshire. And so here it is, 2 days after Election Day 2016, and those students walked into class together, and the student who worked for Hillary Clinton said, as we processed this in the class, she said, I know the student who worked for Trump. I know he's not a bad person. I know that he and I just have very different viewpoints about politics and about what the proper role of a president ought to be. But I know that, politics is politics and we're still going to be friends. And I thought that was really important, that here were two students who had worked actively for the two candidates who had competed against each other in a really bitter election. And they were committed to saying, we're friends, and we're friends before politics get in the way. So again, I come back to, there are lots of people who think differently from you. And finding out why is important. And sometimes it's because they don't know, right? I was telling a story before this started. I have a colleague who voted for Donald Trump and happened to be dating another colleague of mine. And when she found out, they had a fight. And she said, I'm not mad at you for voting for Trump. I'm mad at you because in the course of their argument, he revealed that he hadn't heard anything about the election. He hadn't paid any attention to any of the media coverage of all the terrible things, particularly about women, that were reported. And she said, I'm breaking up with you because you're kind of an idiot, right? Not because he had voted for Trump, but because he hadn't paid any attention to anything at all during the election, right? And so again, sometimes people just don't know. And it is, I think, important that we find out what motivates behavior or what motivates their feelings and try to understand it. And I can say, because I've had conversations, that colleague was then stunned and super apologetic that he had cast a vote for somebody that was so opposed to his own viewpoints. But she was so, my other friend was so furious with him for paying so little attention to the election that she broke up with him anyway. So I'm not necessarily advocating that. But I do think, will there one day be a worse president? It's entirely possible. Again, being engaged is one way to prevent that from happening.
Thank you.
I know our time is short, and Dean Venkatesh has now stood up, so I think I am finished. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I appreciate it.